If you know whence you came, there are absolutely no limitations to where you can go.
When I first started doing YouTube stuff, or tubin' as the kids absolutely do not call it, I made a video about Eternal Darkness. So we're going back there because I think it will help establish some good ground for the new channel, and because I think it'll make people who have been around for too long smile a little. Oh, right, I probably should explain what the deal here is. If you want to get to the meat of the essay, skip to the time code on screen. This channel is called OTHERWORLD ALMANAC. Yes, there's a great rhythm to 3-syllable words that I can't explain that well. This channel is all about stories in video games. Sometimes it's a more sweeping examination of the medium, other times I'll just be talking about a section of story, or a character, or even just some weird piece of minutia I particularly enjoy and feel is worth having someone on the internet blab about on video for some amount of time. Storytelling in video games has just generally been a strong interest of mine for just about ever. In fact, I even made it the focus of my capstone as a philosophy major. If I wanted to be dramatic, I could easily say Nier got me a degree. If you want to say it's for some bigger reason, you could say, quote, because for all the attention video games get nowadays, even in terms of writing, it still feels like they're underappreciated as a legitimate storytelling medium on par with novels or cinema. Or maybe because people talking bad about the medium as a whole for reasons that don't have to do with money just cuts deeper than any positivity about its storytelling potential can stanch. But really, we're here because it's what I think is cool, and hopefully you do too. I'm your host Delia, by the way. It's taken me just about forever to reach the point where I can say with confidence that I'm trans, and I'm not really looking or even sounding the part at this juncture, but yes, I'm trans, and that is relevant to a channel like this because it will account for some perspectives. Not so much today, though. Also, yeah, sorry about the background noise. My current recording conditions aren't necessarily ideal, even when you set aside the nasty summer heat and the amount of fans that I got on. I'll see what I can do to try to work on it, though. I have two sort of mini essays prepared for you today. I'll deal with the one that's probably a little more interesting to most folks second, just to keep you in your seats, or at least to teach you how to use the playback bar on your device. Time code's on screen now, and for those of you who skipped that first part, aren't you happy? First, we will discuss the genre of Eternal Darkness and its roots, and second, we will discuss interactivity and why games as a medium have a special potential for storytelling. Eternal Darkness is notable for many reasons, particularly when you consider its release date in the early 2000s as a GameCube exclusive, but one that I think it doesn't always get full credit for is being a game with a cosmic horror theme in the early aughts. Obviously, it was not the first. Games as far back as some late 80s text adventures featured this style here and there. And then there's this game called Shadow of the Comet that I learned about while doing some research for this, which was later rebadged with the Call of Cthulhu name attached to it. I've never played this, but it does feature this face, so it's probably a pretty good time. Still, I think this is probably one of the first real mainstream cosmic horror-focused console games, where it's the major theme instead of a background element in a game where the narrative can't be basically missed like Phantasy Star Online, which is a cosmic horror story, but I bet even some of you who have played PSO a lot basically didn't even know there was a story. And Eternal Darkness released at a time when knowing much about Lovecraft was still not necessarily the most commonplace thing outside of geek circles, instead of probably at one point in the past 10 years being able to buy a Cthulhu Funko Pop at your local Target. I didn't research whether or not this was the case for this joke, because I thought it was just funny for me to not know. The point is that it really feels like the popularity of cosmic horror, and especially of the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, absolutely exploded in popularity a few years after this game was released. So if that assessment is fair, this game's a bit ahead of its time in this regard. Horror is a very useful genre. I didn't have great things to say about it way back when, but I was inexperienced and, like many of you, don't enjoy being scared. After all, real life is scary enough by itself. But it's helpful to look at horror to see what a society fears. Fear is not the greatest driver of humanity, contrary to popular belief, but it would be utterly stupid to claim it doesn't have some sort of an effect. Cosmic horror is a subgenre that very specifically is about the fear of the unknown. Well, it's about a specific subset of the fear of the unknown. If your story is themed around being afraid of the dark, that's not really cosmic horror by itself. Rather, it's about a fear of things outside of our understanding of the universe and frequently extraterrestrial in nature. So if the darkness comes alive and tries to kill you like the Vashta Nerada, you're a little bit more on track. I assume part of the reason why this focuses so much on the extraterrestrial, thus granting the name cosmic horror, is in order to keep the genre from simply being about whatever bigger, nastier bears happen to live in the parts of the map that said "here be dragons" centuries ago, and underscore that cosmic horror's other themes are typically caught up in modern concerns. The other, frankly far larger, part is mostly because that's what a lot of the pioneers of the genre wrote about, because they wrote in an age of increasing scientific discovery where it made sense to actually think about the extraterrestrial. Though, of course, this definition can get a little bit dicey because, well, would one consider gods inherently extraterrestrial, for example? Yeah, cosmic horror stories are on kind of a vibes-related basis, all told. This admittedly simple concept of cosmic horror is one that's had a pretty long gestation period even before the publication of many of its near-century-old codifying works, with authors like Ambrose Bierce and Edgar Allan Poe being major direct inspirations for their bizarre horror writings, and I think even Guy de Maupassant, a guy I would not associate with the genre, wrote some early sci-fi that could be considered an inspiration for cosmic horror. Even aside from that, the basic fear isn't exactly a new one. I don't think there's been any period in human history where mankind didn't know there was a world outside of what they knew, and or didn't assume it to be full of hostile things. As we become increasingly aware of how very little we've learned about the universe, it becomes easier to imagine a universe full of things unlike what is in our limited scope, and it's not hard to imagine that at least a few of them are hostile, even if your average human hasn't had to worry about whether they're predator or prey in a hot minute. It can be attributed to, in short, the fear of being small in a big Hey, wait a sec. As a note, cosmic horror sometimes lends itself very easily to anti-science themes, primarily through plots involving mankind recklessly exploring places it does not belong, or otherwise that they are advancing too fast. Mostly insofar as it enables humans to encounter the awful truth about the world outside them more easily. It won't come up very much in this story. In fact, since Eternal Darkness takes an interesting tack by allowing the player to defeat the Ancients and their minions through centuries of discovery and advancements in science and magic, and actually, I guess magic is like a science in its own bizarre way, it seems to openly defy this sort of conclusion. But I would be remiss not to mention it at least a little. At least in theory, I think this is a concept that a lot of people understand, but there's a couple of problems here. First of all, for all my posturing about horror as a useful sociological barometer, this approach does have its flaws. Sometimes you get folks who make things more for the sake of them being cool than for them being particularly scary. Horror as a genre often gets looked at as being this very easy to create thing, with a lot of follow the leader going on with folks who enjoyed certain things like Five Nights at Freddy's. I don't think people have any particularly great fear of being murdered by malfunctioning animatronics, it's just people glomming onto a phenom, or all of these grasping horror movie adaptations of everything that enters the public domain. Which, yes, I think you could make a real case about these being themed around the bastardization of your nostalgia for easy profit, or just looking at nostalgia and how easy it is to bungle something meant for children and make them terrifying as horror themes. But I think that's probably not a focus of someone looking at A.A. Milne's Winnie the Pooh and deciding to make a horror movie that even Charles Band would be ashamed of out of it. Cosmic horror, particularly some of its more noteworthy works, feels like a thing that's fallen very heavily into that area of things people just make because they think they're cool and not necessarily to say anything about, well, about anything more than their own personal tastes. In this case, I don't think this is really what's going on with Eternal Darkness. Rather, it's the type of story that makes the most sense to attach to the game mechanics, which are where the real horror comes from, and which is sort of like a cosmic horror concept in and of itself, where something that shouldn't be sentient is. As you've probably guessed from what I've said already, the second part is that cosmic horror is a term associated very heavily with the works of one Howard Phillips Lovecraft, and the works most directly inspired by that, including continuations by people like August Derleth. The names in this are great so far, by the way. Personally, I'm not a fan of reducing cosmic horror to merely eldritch monsters, particularly eldritch monsters as described by one dude and the people who are very specifically building off of that one dude's creations, whether that be expanding the mythos or, let's be frank here, biting the author's style. And for a variety of reasons. The first reason is that making horror just about the big monsters kinda sucks. It feels like grinding it down to only the most crowd-pleasing action movie-ish stuff. Something Godzilla is about horrific things in society first and about big-ass monsters second. Second, and perhaps most superficial if not second most, is that I get really tired of how every eldritch horror is the same. The unknowable is so frequently reduced to a creature with tentacles, sometimes inappropriately placed, that the concept has become a bit laughable. You expect my mind to hurt at the sight of an old friend? Come on! Billithid the Illithid is a brother from another mother as far as I'm concerned. Incidentally, Eternal Darkness does have a little of this going on itself, so let's not call the game free from sin. Though it does this primarily because it seems like there's a running theme to some of the designs that are grounded in what things that live deep in the ocean are like. Once you start getting down into the aphotic zone, creatures deep in the ocean are weird as hell, and are really hard for us to learn much about since the deep ocean is hard to explore. They probably seem like alien life to some people, so consequently, you might pick them as a running theme for the aesthetics of your cosmic monsters. Xelatoth kind of breaks the pattern a little, but Ulyaoth is literally just a jellyfish, and Chaturga kind of looks like some sort of messed up lobster-like creature. So Eternal Darkness isn't just leaning on lazy tropes, it's going back to the roots of the genre and taking a left turn after grabbing the basic concept if you ask me. Which, you're this deep into the video, I'm counting it. However, the genre feels like it's been in stasis in this regard for a while now, in a way that's making it watered down because of its basic nature. Thirdly, well, here I'm running the risk of letting my personal commentary get in the way a little. H.P. Lovecraft was a massive racist. And when I say that, I don't mean in the sense of, oh, well, everyone back then was racist. That's not an unfair statement, and a fuck ton of horror fiction from the era is driven by racism, but Howie was considered extraordinarily racist even for the early 20th century. This is a thing that a lot of people just tend to forget, and I think it absolutely blows that cosmic horror is so strongly associated with him by so many people as a consequence, because some parts of the Cthulhu mythos are soaked in racism to the point where I'm pretty sure it's heavily pared down in most interpretations. It's been a couple years since I saw Dagon, but I'm pretty sure that was kind of lacking in that department compared to the Shadow over Innsmouth. Not that Howie didn't write some more straightforward stuff that didn't deal in the ultra-regressive race politics born of his malnutrition-ravaged mind. The Color Out of Space is a great example of a plainer sort of cosmic horror and is something I'll discuss as quintessential CH, but a lot of Lovecraft's fictional mythos is driven by his racism. It's more like white supremacist propaganda with cosmic horror elements, because, you know, those people don't believe in the same things we do. Although, that might be a bit of an overstatement on the religious aspect here, because Lovecraft himself was a particularly strong atheist as well. He probably wouldn't have been too big a fan of his own villains if they were Christians either. Lastly, i.e. thirdly in the main bullet points, not fourth in the sub-list, is that it's simply a little bit narrow of a description that leaves out some ideas that I think are perfectly fair to call a kind of cosmic horror. Things that are a little bit more solid and don't necessarily involve someone going insane. The degradation of one's own mental faculties while being aware of it is not pleasant to consider, take it from me, but I think that should be divorced from the other major specific theme of cosmic horror, the sheer insignificance of man in the greater scheme of the universe. Earth is just one planet of many, possibly infinitely many. Many of them do not seem to support life like our own, but nothing is stopping that from happening. Or more bizarrely, supporting life unlike anything we would know on Earth. We, after some rounding, know nothing of what's out there in the universe. Look, we're still discovering new species here on Earth. What chance do we have to say we know what life is like in the vastness of the universe? Worse yet, what's to stop some of it from just fundamentally hating us for no good reason other than it's in its nature? This is what makes The Color Out of Space, a story about what is most simply described as a sentient color that doesn't exist on Earth coming from space and wreaking havoc, such a strong example of the genre. It's about something that's incredibly difficult to wrap your head around because it's so alien and so bizarre. You can read about it, but you can't truly picture it in your head. Some section of people in the audience are probably rolling their eyes at the concept of a color that doesn't exist, because wouldn't you just not see it, like in the case of Ambrose Bierce's The Damned Thing? But to cut out all of the complexities on the matter of color vision or dealing with concepts like impossible colors that can only be seen through certain cone responses, there is more to light than the part of the spectrum visible to humans. If you suddenly started to be able to see, say, ultraviolet light, like a bee can, you would probably flip out. It would be incredibly weird. You do not, under any circumstances, quote, gotta hand it to that flaming racist knob-end Howie, but this is actually a good example of the genre that isn't burdened by any of the issues that plague his particular stories of eldritch gods. Look, the point is, I think this stuff is cool and there's more to it than cephalids of astral origin. And a cosmic horror monster should be weird, but it doesn't necessarily have to reduce you to a gibbering wretch or otherwise damage your psyche more than anything else that scares you does. Sometimes it's okay for it to just confound you. It is this specific theme of insignificance that's a major recurring element of Eternal Darkness. It's hammered home over and over that mankind are like insects to the ancients. The only true way to defeat a summoned ancient involves summoning another that can defeat it. Where they come from is not known, and their goals are far bigger in scope than anything on Earth. Yes, even for Chaturga. Pius has his own goals with the revelation of the ancients and isn't just serving them because he's a sycophant, but said goals seem, as far as we can tell, pretty earthly. Meanwhile, the ancients continue to play a game that's way over Pius's head, having merely selected him as a pawn, probably because he just happened to be the one who heard their voices and was curious enough to investigate. The ancients' actions steamroll Pius's motivations, reducing him to a mere servant of the extraterrestrial horror. After completing all three paths, Mantarok is brought back into play, with inscrutable motives that leave the player out in the cold a little, which in and of itself messes with you by making you think you may have just helped out the bad guy. The one that you see even more of, though, is described by the phrase, "There are things man was not meant to know." This is a very Lovecraftian trope. Indeed, all of my spitballing earlier about decoupling the genre at large from Lovecraft's mythos is all for naught here because Eternal Darkness takes after it so strongly. Let's rewind back to The Color Out of Space for a sec to discuss a point I said earlier. If you suddenly started to be able to see, say, ultraviolet light, like a bee can, you would probably flip out. It would be incredibly weird. In some way, that new color can be described as a thing man was not meant to know. A crucial reason why these are things man was not meant to know in most Lovecraftian literature is because they're harmful to the mind of the beholder. As I've said before, this is the part that I think is way overdone, but I'm not confident that it's a requirement. If my memory isn't failing me, The Color Out of Space doesn't delve that hard into this compared to some of Lovecraft, despite my assertion that the color counts as a thing man was not meant to know. And so, the ancients are all definitely things man was not meant to know. This is where the game goes full on Lovecraftian. All of them and their minions are hazardous to the mind, Xelatoth most notably. They're also all hazardous to the body, and some truly horrible things happen to those who come into contact with the artifacts. The term corrosive is used as a descriptor in some cases to describe their influence, which is also reminiscent of how a lot of Lovecraftian horrors tend to affect the real world. Violent at times, yes, but frequently less about mundane gore and brutality and more of a rather unusual way of being destructive. In The Color Out of Space, the blasted heath seems to be lacking in color. The plants go gray rather than the brown you would expect of typical dead plants. For those who are wondering how I feel about this considering my complaints about how common a thing this is, well, if this weren't a video game for 2002 that I think is generally well written and is a good exploration of the genre as a whole, I might be a little more bored with that. As you can tell by my description of things that won't really come up very much, a common secondary theme in cosmic horror is this idea of human curiosity getting the better of the species and turning out to ultimately be harmful. Pius is very pointedly subjected to this. He really only ends up becoming this major threat to humanity looking to summon an ancient because he happened to be the one who heard the voices and was curious enough to investigate. Whatever goals or ambitions he had sure didn't seem to be anywhere near as big when he was just a guy. You see a much more basic version of this throughout, such as Anthony reading a message meant for Charlemagne and getting cursed for it, but a lot of that feels minor compared to the inciting incident. Probably because we're comparing them all to the inciting incident for the story. To wrap this part up, here's one last one for you. Cosmic horror lends itself extremely well to situations involving heavy paranoia. An atmosphere of paranoia hangs over a few situations at the Roivas estate, and once again, with Anthony, hence why he investigates that message meant for Charlemagne, but most notably appears in game mechanics and through the Bone Thief enemies. In particular, these guys remind me very much of the creature from The Thing, or if you prefer to be extra snobby, from John W. Campbell Jr.'s Who Goes There, and goodness knows I'll take whatever excuses to give you more information than you will ever need in your entire life. There's also a bit of that to the true ending, where the game teases you a little with the idea that Mantarok's been playing a long game too, which leaves you with the lingering dread that maybe you have done something terrible. It is perhaps a good thing that Eternal Darkness has a relative lack of dogs. Or maybe it's bad if that's a part of the experience you would enjoy. Anyway, I can't keep alluding to the game mechanics forever, and eventually I kinda have to actually pull the trigger here, so let's end this part of the video for now and get ready for a little lesson in... All the stuff we've talked about is cool, but that wouldn't make Eternal Darkness necessarily that noteworthy. It would likely still be fondly remembered. It might see praise for dealing in cosmic horror back when Lovecraft-oriented everything didn't ooze out of every pore of nerd culture like some kind of hideous pus leaching out of a carbuncle. Some folks might have looked back at it and realized it had a female lead who acted in a display of overt heroism beyond mere self-preservation, whose goal wasn't just to escape her horrid situation and praise on those grounds, which is deserved by the way, but I do agree that this was an era during which not many people cared that much. But they do now, as they rightly should, and such praise would naturally show up in a retrospective, which cares little for the opinions of the era of release. But Eternal Darkness had one special trick up its sleeve. One weird trick. LED displays hate it. Eternal Darkness introduced something called sanity effects. In addition to the player's very normal health and magic meters, they also get a third green bar that measures how well your current character is keeping it together. As this depletes, eventually the camera tips to a Dutch angle, and sanity damage instead starts affecting your health when you run out. But more infamously, the game starts doing all kinds of weird things, such as having you enter a fake room full of ammunition, or you suddenly explode when you try to cast a spell. A more potent one sees the game attempt to loop back to the title screen. Too quick to be a crash really, so it looks like a glitch more than anything. I think there's even one that looks like you have a bug crawling around on your screen. One of the most infamous moments has the game claim to you that you've completed the demo. I can only imagine this caused at least a small amount of players to try shutting the game off in frustration, making them lose progress. Regardless of what happens, the game soon enough dispels the illusion and puts you right back where you were, often restarting the room. This whole bit with the game trolling the player as their sanity goes down not only accomplishes its playing the player goals, but it provides a level of immersion. If you are taking the role of the player character, and the player character's sanity is degrading, yours probably should be too. And what better way than to act like your TV is having issues? Needless to say, some of the ones that are based on things happening to your TV don't work quite so well in the modern day, when most people are playing their games on something that's not a CRT. I'm usually not the sort who champs at the bit over the prospect of a game remake, but I think Eternal Darkness probably needs one more than most games do, and not just to try and get a new audience. While this is cool, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to deny that, there's a lot more to talk about here than just, oh that's neat. Video games have a relatively, not completely, but still, unique and high capacity for interactivity that is not present with most other media. Janet Murray's book, Hamlet on the Holodeck, is one of the small number of older books covering any subjects that could encompass video games as a medium, and while she deals more in online games, the broad strokes, and not even that broad in the grand scheme, still apply pretty nicely to a more contained experience. It's taken a while for video games to be taken seriously as being anything other than toys for children. Back when I was in uni some years ago and dealing in the idea of games as a unique storytelling medium as a capstone in my philosophy degree, this was a bit of an issue for my studies. However, Marie describes an instance of interactivity in a stage performance which we can mirror easily to other mediums of storytelling. On pages 126 to 127 of the updated edition, or pages 100 to 101 in my 1997 copy, because the liminal trance is so inherently fragile, all narrative art forms have developed conventions to sustain it. One of the most important ways they've done this has been to prohibit participation. Suzanne Langer, in her classic study of aesthetics, feeling and form, describes the terrible shock she received as a child watching a performance of James Barrie's Peter Pan. It was my first visit to the theater, and the illusion was absolute and overwhelming, like something supernatural. At the highest point of the action, Tinkerbell had drunk Peter's poison medicine to save him from doing so and was dying. Peter turned to the spectators and asked them to attest their belief in fairies. Instantly, the illusion was gone. There were hundreds of children sitting in rows, clapping and even calling, while the actress, dressed as Peter Pan, spoke to us like a teacher coaching us in a play in which she herself was taking the title role. I did not understand, of course, what had happened, but an acute misery obliterated the rest of the scene and was not entirely dispelled until the curtain rose on a new set. Langer attributes her distress to the fact that art is dependent on establishing distance. To her mind, Barry committed a theatrical sin by violating the fourth wall convention that prohibits actors from acknowledging the spectators, etc. Although this is an instance of distress in which the abstraction of the story is broken, it is, in theory, an attempt to encourage participation. The desired effect, we can reasonably presume, is that the director wanted the audience to feel like they were in the story, still immersed, what we shall call participative immersion. But also, take this as proof that it won't work for everyone. After all, to put you in the walls, they have to open around you and become incomplete. And then, you can always see the seam. Video games are a unique storytelling medium, again, relatively, because of their capacity for participative immersion. This is the part of the essay where I basically just regurgitate some shit you already know, like when a high school mathematical proof forces you to invoke the identity property because apparently you really need to know that something is equivalent to itself, which, I'm sorry, you're probably all reasonably smart, so I'll keep it kinda short. Video games give the player a high level of control over how the narrative is performed in front of them. You only get so much control over the story itself, sure, but the point is that you get to actually do it. There's a layer of abstraction involved, but a player doesn't just read a story, or, as with a choose-your-own-adventure novel, merely guide it. The story can start and end in the same place, but how you get there will vary. It's a type of story that relies on something referred to as mimesis. Imitating a story, or perhaps replicating, is a word that's a little less stinky instead of simply watching. Yes, the word mime comes from the same origins. Even other forms of interactive media don't tend to have such a strong type of mimetic narrative. Okay, hold on a sec, folks. I don't have a very smooth transition here. Yes, there's a joke that writes itself to be found here. But I'd like to take a moment to define the terms I'm using here, which are diegetic and mimetic, derived from diegesis and mimesis, spelled as you see on screen. Diegesis is a term that refers to the literal content of a narrative, the words, the script, you know. Meanwhile, mimesis refers to the acting out of a narrative, the imitation of the acts in a script. To put it simply, diegesis is the telling and mimesis is the showing. You can think of these as typically being in opposition to each other, but more specifically, they tend to be in parallel. Their intersections have often been regarded negatively, and not just because jokes that break the fourth wall are considered extremely easy, lowest common denominator type humor a lot of the time. While a mimetic narrative typically exists for having a story told to you, it's comparatively rare that you think about it very often, and certainly not common to have a piece of media go out of its way to forcibly build certain aspects of that mimetic story for you. Outside of the simplest examples that don't really contain much that can be subjected to a critical eye or deemed to have much greater personal meaning, one of the strongest examples I can think of is people imprinting a character on partially blank protagonists from some games. I hang out with a lot of people who play Final Fantasy XIV and who like to share bits of characterization that they've assigned to their Warrior of Light. That is a way of fleshing out a mimetic story, albeit maybe a little stretched out if they don't get as in character as the game will let them. Regardless of my not-so-good examples, hopefully the ideas of what these words mean came across. I feel they're pretty simple, but I'm also the one giving this talk, so of course I do. We now rejoin the video essay currently in progress. This produces a uniquely, again comparatively so at bare minimum, strong sense of immersion, which makes the medium an interesting one for the purposes of storytelling. Instead of just seeing the story play out before you, you become a part of it. Or at least a very convincing simulacrum. I took 2 years of Latin in high school and got a degree in philosophy, and that word still feels really weird. Just don't pronounce it simulacrum, that's when a guy's pulling this pose. Additionally, the inclusion of mimetic storytelling can create an additional layer of abstraction where an intentional break of immersion, such as that demo notification, can actually pull the player in instead of pushing them out, just by making playing a video game feel like a living experience, where the game responds to your behavior in unique ways. Although, no, I'm sorry to all of you conspiratorial folks out there, the concept of a director or whatever that's handpicking painful RNG for you is over the top, even if the game has some sort of RNG rubber banding to it. Breaking the fourth wall is a common thing in all media, and it tends to present problems for immersion, especially when it's a particularly hard break. We'll use this classic scene from Secret of Evermore as a point of comparison. While he makes extremely overt references to the fact that you're in a video game, it's a type of writing that's in universe about the idea and doesn't say something that's so literal about the idea as, say, Mumbo from Banjo-Kazooie calling himself the best shaman in the game, which is a joke and is intended to be so. Rareware isn't trying to get too postmodern with their narratives, but I'm using this face value read as an example because it was the first thing I came up with. The Secret of Evermore bit has what I almost want to describe as plausible deniability. You could put yourself in the sneakers of our boy protagonist and totally imagine this guy giving this kind of public performance without it taking you out of the narrative, even though the joke is literally, hey, you're playing a video game. Postmodern storytelling versus jokes that look like undercooked attempts at postmodern storytelling when taken at face value, basically, since your average Rareware game is, again, just using it to be humorous. Video games as a medium have been chasing greater forms of immersion for a long time, such as virtual reality. I'm not sure if these do or don't improve the storytelling experience, but what I can say more definitively is that a lot of this does rely on several elements of the actual game, and there's where things tend to get tied up nowadays. I don't know if I'm a great person to talk about this because I don't tend to get that immersed in stuff, but I think a lot of games try for what I would consider to be the crudest form of this, with things like letting you name your character and the like. And sure, not everything is going to go as far as Fallout 4 did, especially for multiple characters.
Mr. Fucker!
But it does still take me out of things a little to hear a character mention you in the voice acting, and then you don't get to hear your name said. Consequently, the two layers of abstraction created by mimetic storytelling and diegetic storytelling more or less flatten back into one, as the realization that you really don't have that much control over things reduces the effectiveness of the mimetic story. Yes, I know there would probably always be holes in this anyway. There is presently no way to cover all bases, especially for things where people choose more username-ish character name choices like mobile games, without resorting to on-the-fly AI voice acting, which still has failings. You can see something similar happen in this clip of trying an oddball name like Lafcadio on Hypnospace Outlaw, which uses your computer's inbuilt text reading functionality to voice anything that would refer to you by name. So I'm going to play around with a name that I was using for another project that ended up falling to the wayside, and let's see how this bot pronounces that, or if it chokes to death.
Lafcadio.
I don't think that's correct. And AI would guess and would get things wrong from time to time. I'm not even getting into any of the messy shit to do with AI here, I just don't think it'd work as well as you'd want, and it would fail rarely enough, yet still often enough to be anti-immersive. If it failed more often, you could accept that as part of the world that you're in. When it fails that rarely, but still that regularly, it becomes a thing that you instead accept as part of the game. It happens on the wrong layer, and everything falls apart. There probably isn't a good solution to this, because just removing the voice acting presents the potential immersion obstacle of, well, no voice acting. If that's something you need, which I suppose will vary based on the person. Basically, this works best for something like Eternal Darkness, which is a self-contained story, or it does if you can immerse yourself into the role of the player character. I think this is at least partly because of the expectation involved. You know that a story like Eternal Darkness, with a fixed, non-nameable player character, is not about you, or at least there is an additional layer of abstraction between yourself and the player character than there would be if you chose to play off a nameable character as a personal avatar. And of course, let's not forget the disconnect that occurs when you hear a piece of dialogue while you have subtitles and the line is different. I always notice this when it happens, even when it's as simple as missing out on vocal tics, and it always bugs me, with perhaps the lone exception being Zack and Bobby in Saints Row the Third and its sequel, because I absolutely believe a ton of those lines were ad-libbed and the characters just have such a perfect synergy. And the excellent voice acting absolutely helps with that. But enough of my being a gaming boomer parentheses derogatory, here's me being a gaming boomer parentheses informational. The kind of immersive experience that Eternal Darkness offers, the kind where it openly reminds you that it's a video game, but uses this to enhance the immersion of the experience rather than to actively break it the way every fourth wall bit seems to, is, to my knowledge, pretty rare. The sanity effect mechanic was subject to a patent, which means that while some games probably had similar ideas, they were severely restricted in terms of just directly emulating it. After all, we know how Nintendo loves to bully emulators regardless of whether or not the letter of the law is on their side. But also, we don't have to actually look for literal examples of this sort of thing. One of my favorite video games of all time, EarthBound, features a pretty similar idea. About halfway through the game, a character calls you and says he's collecting player names for a school project. This pops up once more as a one-off thing where the game asks you to confirm this, but it still doesn't seem to do much until the very end of the game. Things go south pretty hard during the final boss. Nothing you can do against Gigas seems to make a difference until Paula begins to pray. Even that doesn't last forever, but when you pray one last time after Paula's call is absorbed by the darkness, the prayers touch one last heart. Someone who's always been there and whose presence has always been felt, but whose face nobody in the game has ever really seen. You. The attacks from the prayer keep coming, gradually unveiling the identity of the mysterious benefactor as matching your last entered player name. It's you praying from the bottom of your heart for these children's safety, and the power of this is what finally gives them the win. You beat Gigas. This is the level of hype that pretty much every shonen anime aspires to, but which none can ever quite manage. I'd say it's also like a weirdly backwards version of what's going on in Eternal Darkness in some sense, if that makes any sense. The other moment in gaming that feels in line with what Eternal Darkness was doing before Eternal Darkness is the Psycho Mantis boss fight in Metal Gear Solid. Before the fight, Mantis psychoanalyzes you based on some statistics the game harvests without your knowledge, and he also will read your memory card, searching for save files for certain games, mostly other Konami titles, to try to divine some of the player's gaming habits.
So, you like Suikoden? So, you like Azure Dreams? You like Castlevania, don't you?
Obviously, this has certain limits, and I suspect it's pretty easy to tell that he's just reading stuff based on what's saved on your memory card. I confess I already knew about this the first time I played Metal Gear Solid, so it didn't work on me so well, and now I've possibly ruined it for you. Let me ruin things further, because in the upcoming boss fight, the game appears to glitch out. Again, doing a trick that really only works for CRT televisions, and which you can easily tell is the game acting weird by the fact that it says Hideo and not video. After this point, your ability to fight Mantis decently absolutely tanks. By all accounts, he seems able to tell what you're doing before you do it. He's very literally reading your inputs, which is hyped up as reading your mind, and probably as close as the PS1 could get anyway. The solution, BT dubs, is to switch which controller port your controller is connected to. No, this won't interfere with your ability to control the game, and yes, I'm completely serious about this. Absolute genius move on Kojima's part, and it's probably no surprise that Silicon Knight's next project after Eternal Darkness was to remake the original MGS. After Eternal Darkness, though, this doesn't seem to have been something people have done much with. Fans have reminisced heavily about this mechanic and spoken fondly of it, yet I can't think of a whole lot of cases of something similar, with space being left for the fact that a lot of the pieces of the machine that is Eternal Darkness are patented, and replicating them may result in something that is in some way legally actionable, or at least that a bunch of bullies can pretend is legally actionable to suppress growth of the medium and crassly exert control for its own sake. The best I can name offhand is Yoko Taro's Nier series asking you to delete your save file in order to complete the story arc. Now, obviously, this isn't to say that immersive games don't exist past Eternal Darkness. I've played Hypnospace Outlaw. As I said, this is a special kind of immersion. This is the place where the line between diegesis and mimesis becomes blurry. This instance is special for one very specific reason. It's really hard to do in a way that's convincing. A potential problem is that you might want to try to have the diegetic story be a little more open-ended if you want to make it cross with the mimetic story. This is something that a video game, at least on paper, looks like it could do more of than most other media, but there's still limitations in place, and that can make things feel worse. Seeing the absolute limit of how much choices can truly matter play out before you is enough to perhaps make you a little nihilistic about the whole concept of choice in video games. Ain't that right, Ken Levine? So instead, devs have to arrive at something more creative, i.e. esoteric, to pull this off. One of my other concerns is that any form of doing this doesn't really have a long shelf life. As we've seen, technology has changed, and a lot of Eternal Darkness's tricks don't really work so well anymore. Furthermore, I think seeing someone immediately jump to hurling accusations at a work that is very clearly inspired by another, as becomes more noticeable as social media continues to give voice to the most unhinged takes of all, just as much as all the others, kind of sucks for lack of a better term. But this is a place where originality is something that's paramount, because otherwise it wears off. It's cool seeing Eternal Darkness start messing with you to help get you in the zone, but if I saw another game do it, I would probably immediately think, wow, this is kind of like Eternal Darkness. It would take me out of the experience rather than drag me in deeper, because now I'm thinking about other video games I've played and how this one compares to it, thus meaning now I'm specifically thinking of it as a video game, once again making clear the distinction between the diegetic and mimetic stories, and consequently sundering the link. Now, I'm not involved in an immersive horror experience that's trying to play with my head, I'm playing an Eternal Darkness-like. And you people thought Metroidvania was a crappy term. Of course, as usual with any story to do with video games, the villain of this piece is really the entire video game industry, which is so obsessed with turning a profit that it has provided no room for experimentation in its constant racing of itself to the bottom, meaning that experimental stories really only exist in indie games you've never heard of and will never play them on that basis, and in the very few rare instances where a large company actually chooses to believe in a smaller company and let them do something like this. So for as much as I dunk on Nintendo for all their many, many bad practices, in this case I have to say good on them for believing in Silicon Knights. A little over 20 years ago, but still, nevertheless, good on them for believing in Silicon Knights. Also, I'm really, really bad at this game, so I want to take a moment to shout out my friend Plastic Alan, who let me use his footage of his playthroughs of the game. But hey, I'm just spitballing at this point. The real point here is that, regardless of the quality of the story, which is still pretty decent, but I can see why it may not appeal to everyone, Eternal Darkness does something incredibly unique in how it communicates that to the audience. This is without a doubt the thing that makes the game the most memorable, and for good reason. The actual narrative itself doesn't have to particularly appeal to you for it to be abundantly clear from its presentation that the medium has unique potential in this department, providing an experience you can't get anywhere else. At least, not in a way that wouldn't be incredibly cumbersome. And that's why I'm interested in this sort of thing. I think we're only just out of the woods in terms of video games being considered anything more than a novelty, but I also think this is something that's been true of a great many art forms throughout history, especially the more modern ones, and nowadays those are generally pretty widely accepted as being worthy narrative vehicles, capable of all the morality and pathos of the written word or of still art. Video games aren't particularly unusual among the mediums. All we need is something to make one consider them worthy. And that is why Eternal Darkness is the kind of game I want to look at for this channel more than perhaps any other. I think it's safe to say this is why I started scripting anything for the channel in the first place, and why when I gave the channel that big ol' reboot, I bumped it up in the order. Even if we dismiss the story as being non-resonant popcorn schlock, a description I don't think applies by the way, but bear with me here for a sec, my point is that Marvel movies have yet to make films be considered an unworthy medium. The way it's told is the thing that tells you that yes, video games will tell you something in a way that is different from other media that makes them worthy of being considered narrative art. Tragically, there just don't seem to be that many other games like it. At least, not by enough. And if they are nowhere near as accessible as Eternal Darkness, which is just as much of a tragedy, and I can only hope that one day the state of video gaming improves. As accessible as Eternal Darkness. I haven't read through the full updated edition of Hamlet on the holodeck, by the way, since my copy and the one I used in uni were both the original print, which predates this game by 5 years, but I'm kind of curious if Janet Murray is aware of Eternal Darkness and what she'd think of it. It's not an online game, which is mostly what the book was about, but I think she'd find it worthwhile nonetheless. Anyway, that's the end of this first video for the channel. Thank you for watching if you got this far, or even if you just skipped here. The links to my Patreon and social media and stuff are down in the description. I would greatly appreciate the support. I don't have outro graphics prepped yet, and I don't have an outro prepped for this episode. And it's late and I need a shower because I'm about as sweaty as you might expect me to be from making a video like this. I'll see you all sometime towards the beginning of next month or something for the next video. And thank you very much to Plastic Ellen and Mile Marker, who have been supporting me through a long time and continue to support me through this off period that I've had. Yeah, okay, now I'm done. Good night. I paid a whopping $50 for this game. I think that was probably like 6 years ago, but yes, $50. And it is, believe it or not, complete in box for $50. I can only imagine how horrific the price is now because retro game collecting is absolutely cooked.